and welcome to Crimes Through Time, a weekly snapshot of crime history. In October 1923, 13-year-old John Johnston was a newspaper boy delivering to flats in Newland Street, Coatbridge, where he encountered Susan Newell. She was a woman with a temper who had a history of being violent. What exactly happened between the two is unknown, but Susan would strangle John to death. The crime would be discovered the next day during a clumsy attempt by Susan to dispose of the young man's body. Evidence to convict Susan of the killing was overwhelming, but now 100 years later, the motive is still a complete mystery. Let's explore the go-kart murder that would lead to Susan Newell being the last woman hanged in Scotland. Susan McAllister was born in 1893. She married young and had a daughter, Janet MacLeod, in 1915. Unfortunately, she was widowed when her husband was killed while fighting in World War I. By 1923, Susan had remarried to John Newell. He was a former serviceman who now worked on the Glasgow subway. They lived with Janet, who was now 8 years old, in Newland Street, Coatbridge, which is located about 9 miles outside of Glasgow, Scotland. It was a less than happy union. John was a drunkard and womanizer, and Susan had a short and violent temper. On the 19th of June 1923, she assaulted John, beating him around the head. He reported her to the police, and the following day they had another argument which involved violence on Susan's part. John left the house and went to his sister's home. Even though the family had only been renting the flat for 3 weeks, Mrs. Young, the landlady, had already given them notice to quit because of the consistent fighting. John Johnston left his home in the afternoon of the 20th of June, 1923, to meet a friend. Around 6 p.m, he set off around Coatbridge to deliver the 9 copies of the evening newspaper he had to earn a little pocket money. Around 6:45 p.m, he knocked on the door of Susan Newell. She invited him in and accepted a newspaper from him. One theory of the following events is that Susan wanted the paper for free, but John insisted that he needed to be paid. It was this defiance that made Susan lose control, and she attacked John. Other residents would report loud thumps and an adult voice shout, quote, "Shut the fucking door." Sometime later, Janet would return home from playing out to see John's body lying on the couch. Susan would then make her daughter help her wrap John's body in an old red rug. She was now left with the problem of what to do with John and how to get away with the murder. Susan decided to sleep on the issue and tackle it the next day. In the morning of the 21st of June, Susan and Janet moved John's body, still wrapped in the rug. They loaded him into a go-kart. This is more of a handcart rather than a go-kart that is ridden. Janet then sat on top and Susan started out towards Glasgow on foot. Mrs. Young, the landlady, would report that the front door was left open and it was her cart that had been taken and used. Several people saw the pair on their journey towards the city. Thomas Dixon, a passing lorry driver, offered them a lift into Glasgow, which they accepted. He was apparently unaware of what the cart was carrying, other than to note, quote, "It weighed a ton," when he loaded it into his vehicle. He dropped them off on Duke Street in the east end of the city. At the same time that Thomas arrived and dropped off Susan, Janet and the cart, Helen Elliott, a local resident, was getting ready to go shopping. She observed Thomas unload the car and drive away, but when Susan manoeuvred it onto the pavement, the rug slightly unwrapped, revealing John's foot. Shocked but in a little disbelief, Helen called her sister, and at a discreet distance they followed Susan. She turned down a quiet alleyway and dumped the rug in a corner. Helen asked Robert Foote and James Campbell to summon a policeman. By chance, one was close by and was able to attend quickly. Helen described Susan and what she had seen. Susan was caught climbing over a wall which led to the back green in a bid to escape, but she was arrested. The rug was unwrapped and John was discovered. Susan blurted out to the policeman at the scene that she was not responsible for the death of John. Her husband had been the real killer, and he had forced her and Janet to clean up after him, disposing of the body in the east end of Glasgow, where she believed she would go unnoticed. She would stick to this version of events throughout, even at trial. On the 22nd of June, the post-mortem was carried out. It was clear John had been subjected to a violent attack. His windpipe had burst, and he had extensive head injuries. Several sections of his skull were caved in. He had also suffered extensive burns, which had occurred while he was still alive. The same day, John Newell handed himself in to the police station in Haddington. He was arrested for the murder of John Johnston, and both he and Susan stood trial together. They appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court on the 8th of September 1923. Both pled not guilty, and John lodged a special defence of alibi. The trial began on the 18th of September at the High Court in Glasgow and was heard by Lord Ellis. The case against John fell apart on day 2. He could prove from many witnesses that he had been away the night prior to the murder, and that the day of he had actually attended the funeral of his brother, and had stayed again with family that night. It transpires that the police were well aware, but they had decided that a woman couldn't have had the strength to inflict the injuries on the victim, so moved forward with charges anyway. The judge withdrew the charges and released him immediately, stating for the record that charges should never have been brought. He left the dock without even a glance at Susan. There were 70 witnesses that testified against her, including Mrs. Young, the landlady, Thomas, who drove the lorry, and Helen, whose eagle eye had spotted John. But most importantly, Janet testified about seeing her mother with John's body on the couch and how she had helped her. She also told of the cover story that her mother had coached her to say if they had been caught, blaming John Newell's for the crime, which must have been a very daunting task for an 8-year-old. The defence put forward that Susan had been insane at the moment of the murder, but this was refuted by the prosecution's expert witness, Professor John Glacier, who had examined her while she had been on remand. A verdict was reached in 37 minutes, but the jury was not unanimous. One juror believed her insanity defence. She was convicted by a majority verdict. The jury were unanimous in their call for mercy to be shown. The judge passed the sentence of death. She was sent back to Duke Street, the same street she disposed of John on when she was remanded to Glasgow Prison, which stood there at this time. There she was to be examined by psychiatrists. The results of those assessments found her legally sane. A petition was raised to reduce her sentence to penal servitude because she was a woman and that her husband had abandoned her, leaving her penniless and homeless. Scotland hadn't hanged a woman in 70 years prior to Susan. In total, Scotland would only execute 12 women. The Secretary of State for Scotland, Viscount Novar, rejected the petition, citing the law had to be seen as in line with the rest of the Union, and just 10 months previous, a woman, Edith Thompson, had been hanged in England for arguably a lesser crime. Therefore, he would not interfere with the law. Her execution was set for the 10th of October 1923. For the first time in all the proceedings, Susan would show emotion. She called out for her daughter and fainted. She would recover her defiant nature, though. She approached the gallows with courage and dignity. Hangman John Ellis, assisted by Robert Baxter, began to strap Susan in. She allowed him to strap her legs and thighs without protest, but was able to get her wrists free from her body belt and removed her white hood that covered her face. She shouted, quote, "Don't put that thing over me," and looked directly at John Ellis. The noose was already in place, and not wanting to make a scene by fighting with Susan, he simply pulled the lever. She was hanged with her face in full view of those officials there to witness her death. She never admitted to her crime or explained why it happened. John Ellis, the executioner, always maintained that witnessing Susan hanged didn't affect him, but it likely compounded the effects of hanging Edith Thompson 10 months earlier, who hemorrhaged when the trapdoor opened. In March 1924, he resigned. Suffering from depression and drinking heavily, he attempted suicide by shooting himself in the jaw. At this time, suicide was a criminal offence, and John Ellis was charged and bound over for 12 months at Rochdale Magistrates' Court. The role of executioner was often regarded with disgust. Many were verbally and physically assaulted. French executioner Henri Anatole Diable summed it up, quote, "To kill in the name of one's country is a glorious feat, one rewarded with medals. But to kill in the name of the law, that is gruesome, horrible function, rewarded with scorn, contempt, and loathing by the public." John Ellis would never recover from his experiences, and in September 1932, he cut his throat with a razor and passed away. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and let me know what you think of this case in the comments below, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next one.